Two guys are standing on a grassy hill and looking at the wide open spaces. A guy with brown hair is holding a shovel, and a guy with white hair is holding a flag. Four weird little animals are sitting at their feet. The white flag with symbols is fluttering in the wind. The brunette is happy and smiles and looks into the distance, while his friend is calm. The little animals are charged with energy. The brunette mentally greets the viewer and says that his name is Kim Soo-ho. The little animals are shouting out sounds one by one. The hero corrects himself and says that here his name is Lloyd Frontera. The hero swings his shovel with a smile and says that here. The hero plunges the shovel into the ground. The ground under the hero's feet begins to glow and a large blue circle appears under him, lined with a checkered pattern. The circle begins to expand and all the surroundings around the heroes turn into a blue checkered field. A model of skyscrapers begins to appear above the ground from glowing lines. The hero says that this is the story of an ordinary civil engineer. The vast expanses begin to turn into a model of a city with skyscrapers. The hero continues that this builder has completely changed the world. The hero looks at the model of the city spread out under the mountains. He addresses his partner by the name Javier, to which Javier calmly responds with the words, "Yes, Mr. Lloyd." Lloyd spreads his arms in a crazy smile and shouts that it is all money. Mr. Lloyd laughs loudly, to which Javier asks if his master has gone crazy. A medieval town at night, several years ago. A notification appeared that the hero had chosen the absolute and that he could make a wish. A congratulation appeared. The guy lay on the ground dissatisfied and looked at the congratulations. The notification said that he had become one of the heroes of the novel The Knight of Iron and Blood. He recognized this novel because he read it yesterday. The hero was asked to try hard and wish good luck in the message. He did not understand what wish and what request were being discussed, did not understand why he was imagining it, because he was not even drunk. The hero opened his mouth in surprise. The thought came to him that perhaps this was a migration into a body from another world, which often appears in web novels. The hero assumed that he ended up in another world. The hero was lying in the middle of the road leading to the city. He did not understand why he woke up, having fallen to the ground. He convulsively got up and complained about the night cold. The guy's mouth shifted to the side and was cartoonishly small, which caused him reasonable surprise. A red notification bar appeared. It said that the mouth was crooked as a result of sleeping on the street. The guy slapped the notification window with displeasure, annoyed by his style of speaking. He adjusted his mouth and said that he had moved into the body of the hero of the novel, wondering who he had become in this novel. The hero called himself a man living in a village and sleeping on the road. Someone called out Mr. Lloyd and the guy turned thoughtfully. An unknown figure approached the surprised brunette. The man said that he had been looking for him for a long time. A golden sword guard peeked out from behind his belt. The man's hair was silver like the moon. A calm guy in a blue semblance of a uniform stood in front of the hero and asked him to return to the mansion. This was the main character of the novel, Javier. The brunette broke out in a cold sweat. In his thoughts he noted that Javier was the same as in the pictures of the novel. He noticed that he was addressed by the name of Lloyd. Javier in a cloak and with a glowing sword. He was a sword master who, as the plot of the novel developed, became famous throughout the continent. But at the beginning of the novel he was only a knight guarding the baron, whose eldest son's name was. The hero suddenly realized who he was and screamed, was he really that prankster Lloyd Frontera? Javier looked calmly at the fleshed boy. A slight surprise touched his face and he said that he did not call the boy a prankster, only called him by name. Javier smiled slightly and said, well, that Lloyd correctly assessed himself. The notification reported that Javier looked pleased, to which Lloyd mentally asked the notification to shut up. In front of the heroes was a large two-story mansion in the night. Javier stirred the wood in the fireplace and asked the hero if he remembered how he ended up on the road. Lloyd sat wrapped in a warm blanket while Javier explained to him that Lloyd had been drinking since dinner and broke all the dishes in the tavern, then got homesick and fell asleep on the way. In his mind, Lloyd noted that this was expected on the day of the prankster. Javier continued to explain that the Baron was worried about his son and sent him away. He noted that even if the son was a prankster, the Baron would be sad if his son died on the street with a crooked mouth. Lloyd noted that Javier spoke without any fear. Lloyd felt the floor and dreamed of a heated floor, but suddenly realized that he was in a medieval fantasy. Javier turned around and told the hero to rest and said that he would report to the Baron about his tricks tomorrow morning, to which Lloyd asked not to tell and immediately received a negative answer. Javier was impenetrable, like a wall. Javier had already opened the door as Lloyd turned to him. The guy with a strange smile asked if they had much light at home. Javier closed his eyes, surprised by the strange words. He slammed the door behind him without answering. The hero silently thought he knew the entire content of this novel. In his world, lying in a narrow room, finishing reading the last chapter on his phone, he knew the fate of his character. On the cold floor, the pale hands of the Baron and his wife lay on top of each other. The hero knew that at the very beginning of the novel they fell for vile swindlers, lost all their fortune and committed suicide. Lloyd was lying drunk on the table and asking to be served alcohol. After killing his parents, he began to beg and drink non-stop. Lloyd vomited blood and held his throat. Dropping the mug, he died. The guy threw off the blanket and screamed that even if he had become an aristocrat, his life was as worthless as in Korea. He mentally turned to the absolute, remembered the notification sign, tried to understand what it was up to. He did not understand why he had stuck it in this body. Morning came and the town under the mountains was illuminated by the sun. The white walls of the mansion shone in the sun. Xavier walked calmly behind the lady in the white dress, who was clarifying what Lloyd had done in the tavern last night. It was his mother named Marbella Frontera. Lloyd stood there shabby and realized that he had actually read a novel yesterday. An agitated Marbella asked her son to go and apologize to her. Lloyd did not let his mother finish and immediately agreed, guiltily scratching the back of his head. He understood that he was responsible for the pogrom that his body had committed yesterday. Marbella and even Xavier suddenly opened their eyes in surprise, which was noticed by the pop-up notification. The hero did not understand. Should he not be at least a little proud of him? The sky above the medieval houses was clear and calm. A man was putting bales of straw into a cart. Something caught his attention. Xavier and Lloyd were approaching him along the street along the barrels and windows. The frightened man immediately hid behind his cart, not even thinking to look in the direction of those walking. Lloyd looked at him questioningly. All the passers-by on the street shuddered and ran in different directions, only noticing Lloyd with his companion. The surprise on Lloyd's face only grew. The little boy looked at the walking couple with curiosity. Then he was pulled inside the house with the words that he must not look at him. The window sashes slammed shut. A pop-up notification informed the boy that the villagers hated him. He replied that he had already noticed it. Lloyd walked without taking his hands out of his pockets, asked why Xavier was following him. Xavier kept his hand on the hilt of his sword and said that the Baron ordered him to guard him and make sure that Lloyd did not repeat yesterday. The hero asked again in surprise, did he really need to guard him? Xavier calmly replied that it would be more accurate to protect the residents from him, to which the hero called himself a monster, not suspecting inside what he had done before. Lloyd looked around guiltily, realizing that he first needed to clean up his image so that at least someone would give him a piece of bread when he started begging. He mentally stopped himself, deciding that it would be better to somehow sort out his family debt first. He imagined himself bathing in huge honeycombs, realizing that in this case, as the successor to the owner of the village, he would be able to live in luxury for the rest of his life. Lloyd mentally asked if there were any cheats here. A blue window immediately appeared in front of him and he was surprised that there were skills here. Lloyd's skills on the table were such skills as worthlessness and drunkard. Dissatisfied, Lloyd tried to knock this table down with his hands, but Xavier, who saw nothing, looked at his master with embarrassment. Lloyd, struggling with the table, went ahead. Xavier called out to him and asked where he was going. Lloyd only turned to the white-haired man in confusion. There was a tavern on the side of the guys. Xavier stopped at the level of the door, looking at the guilty gentleman and pointed to the tavern, asking if the apology was really a lie. Lloyd began to deny it. Xavier fell silent in confusion. Indignant Lloyd began to shower him with questions. Xavier closed his eyes and invited the gentleman to come in. Lloyd slowly opened the door, looked inside with an apology, to which Xavier, standing behind him, could not find words. He looked at the gentleman calmly, but internally he understood that something was wrong with him since yesterday, as if he had become a different person. In the tavern, all the furniture was broken. Cracks were crawling along the wall, the trophy skulls were half broken. Lloyd fell heavily onto a chair and loudly declared that he wanted to apologize for his pranks. Xavier watched in surprise. The bald owner of the tavern took a fighting stance, which was noted by the blue notification window. Lloyd looked at the owner of the tavern, bewildered, as he stuttered and asked the gentleman to stop. The hero thought that perhaps this happened because such a non-entity as he suddenly began to speak respectfully. Lloyd looked away, deciding to change his strategy, briefly and rudely asked for forgiveness. The notification plate noted the inappropriate behavior of the apologetic man. The hero still could not understand what it required of him. The bald man, covered in sweat, bowed and stuttered that everything was fine and that the hero did not need to apologize. Lloyd remained silent in surprise, but looked at the owner of the tavern. The sky was clear and bright. Xavier and Lloyd crossed a small bridge. The hero noted with difficulty that the innkeeper's face, even after the apology, was not very good. Xavier noted that this was not surprising. He looked at the guy and said that all the utensils and dishes that he had broken were bought with money earned with sweat and blood, and that perhaps only by receiving compensation would the innkeeper be satisfied. Lloyd was indignant, thinking that there were only debts at home and there could be no talk of compensation. He still could not admit that he could not look good in the eyes of the residents. The hero understood that if he did not sort out the debts, then nothing would work out, but he did not understand how to do this. Xavier continued the story, throwing the hero off track even more, saying that in addition to the pogrom, the health of the inn's mother left much to be desired. Lloyd looked away, remembering the only fireplace in the inn and how cold it was there. The boys walked on the bare ground, while Lloyd continued to think about how hard it would be for old people to survive in such cold weather until they invented a floor heating system. The hero stopped, while Xavier continued to walk. Lloyd stared into space in amazement. A light bulb went on in his head. He looked down thoughtfully, realizing that something. The light bulb in his head sparkled. He realized that something had come to his mind. His eyes opened wide. The light bulb in his head burst into a flash of electricity. The hero compared it to a sudden explosion and the idea that came after it. A green line rushed through space. There were many more of them, and together they formed something big, taking shape more and more with each passing second. Lloyd diligently imagined a floor heating system in his head. He thought that if he created a heating system in this world, it would definitely sell. The hero imagined his body turning over tables and realized that the fool Frontera had never even dreamed of it. He saw his true self above the body and told himself that this was possible for Kim Soo-ho. Kim Soo remembered many schemes in his head. He was a construction engineer, remembered how in the army he tried to build a house alone. He remembered how he carried piles of bricks on special carriers, remembered how he worked day and night on construction sites. Lloyd smiled and mentally realized that this was his plan, with which he would cover all the debts of the Baron's family. Encouraged, Lloyd turned around and told his frozen companion to return to the tavern. Lloyd turned and shouted that they were going to receive the first order. The notification announced the beginning of the hero's real journey. It said that the relationship point system was activated, said that the hero can gain reputation by interacting with others. At the moment, the amount of reputation was 0. Lloyd looked at the huge blue signs in front of his face in confusion. The hero frowned and thought what PR was it something like experience? A system window appeared, that by improving relations with the main characters, he could get PR. He turned his head and thought that something was appearing above Xavier's head. The system window said that his interest level in Lloyd was -30. He thought that this was probably a very low level. The guy smiled nervously and turned to his companion. He smiled and said that he was very handsome. Xavier raised his eyebrows and said that he knew. A system window appeared, that his interest level in the hero dropped to -31. Lloyd turned away and thought that he would leave it for later. If he continued, it would only get worse. After a while, the hero looked at the sheet in surprise and said that the customer was the innkeeper, the performer was Lloyd Frontera. He smiled and said that the construction costs are deducted from the amount of compensation for the damage caused. The innkeeper looked at him with a stony face. A system window appeared that he did not trust him. The skill mental wall emanated from him. The hero thought that this was their problem, not a drop of trust. The young man pursed his lips and thought that he could not ruin his grand plan from the very beginning, did not want to use this method. He decided to use the characteristic of insignificance. Lloyd grimaced and said that they would see each other often, so they should trust each other. The innkeeper began to write on the paper. The hero thought that this trash really works. He smiled and thought that the first contract was signed. Xavier looked at him with distrust, while Lloyd said that he made an excellent choice and would definitely not regret it. After a while, the guy held a shovel and thought that his plan was not that grand, so precise calculations were not required. He turned around when his companion called out to him. The blue-haired man frowned and said that he blackmailed the innkeeper into signing the contract. Was this really a new level of tyranny? Lloyd looked at him silently. He raised an eyebrow and asked if he really had no logic at all. Had he heard of cognitive distortion? The hero extended a finger and explained that the distortion occurs because every cell in the brain is stereotypes and negative thoughts, as if it was like this in the past, then it will be like this in the future. Xavier looked at him and said that it was not a stereotype, but experience and statistics. Lloyd looked at him and asked, after all, experience and statistics are all in the past, aren't they? The blue-haired man silently looked at him and thought what was going on. Had he really formulated his thoughts so correctly before? He shuddered when Lloyd said that they would smile. The guy stuck the shovel into the ground and said that both the innkeeper and his mother would laugh with joy. He stuck the shovel deeper. The hero threw away the earth and thought that their smiles would be the foundation of his earnings. He wielded the shovel and thought that he needed to dig, move, compact the earth and repeat. Lloyd hammered nails into the wood and thought that the lumber from the warehouse in the mansion would be an excellent basis for the central wooden frame. He lay down next to the building and thought that it was enough to apply river clay and the frame was ready. The guy was covered in sweat and thought how weak his body was. Xavier came closer and said that he did it quickly. The hero shouted, did it really take a whole week? The blue-haired looked at him in surprise and thought that he was really building something. Where did he learn how to do this? Did he really decide to honor the contract? For a rowdy like him it was impossible. Lloyd stood up and said that his bones were aching, but there was no time to rest. He took the axe, then he swung, but suddenly he began to fall. His hand was caught. Xavier didn't let him fall. He took the axe from him. The guy looked back and asked what he needed to do. Lloyd answered with surprise that he needed boards measuring 1 span horizontally and 2 spans vertically. The blue-haired man threw up some logs. He swung bloodthirstily, and with one blow he chopped them. The perfect boards fell to the ground. The hero's jaw almost dropped. He gave him a thumbs up. The guy looked at his subordinate's back and thought that he was definitely a sword master. He didn't even need modern tools. The brunette put his hand on the guy's shoulder and called him by name. He picked up the shovel and asked if he would help him with the digging when he finished. Xavier frowned and thought that not only did he not thank him, but he also made him work. How could he forget about his character? A system window appeared that Xavier regretted his decision. Lloyd leaned over to him and asked if he had helped out of curiosity, that he would definitely cheat someone, but in what way? He wanted to see the result, then what should be done, right, finish what was started, and what should be done to finish it faster. The guy smiled and said that they needed to work together. Xavier looked at him irritably. He thought that the brunette was right, and for several days now he had been completely different, but he still could not trust him because of his past. The blue-haired man got to work and decided that he would be able to check it only after finishing the job. Xavier was digging with sweat on his brow. Lloyd was also working. He threw back the earth. The hero lifted the shovel triumphantly and stuck it into the ground. He raised his fist and shouted that the construction was complete. Lloyd looked defiantly at the sky. Xavier asked him what kind of hieroglyph it was. He replied that it was the logo of his brand. The hero looked back and asked if it was time for a check. He raised his head and continued, wasn't it time to see how he had fooled the innkeeper? Xavier looked at him silently. The wind was rustling. The fireplace was crackling. Smoke was coming out of the chimney of the house. The old woman was lying on the floor and saying how nice it was here. She was smiling and said that her joints were finally resting. The innkeeper raised his eyebrows and asked how this was possible. Lloyd smiled and thought that the people of this world could only be surprised. The old woman was smiling and thought that this power of heating the floors was almost like magic. The innkeeper looked at the hero and thanked him. He said that he had not seen his mother smile for a long time. Xavier opened his eyes in shock and thought that the innkeeper and his mother were laughing as he said. He looked at the hero and thought how this was possible. In one morning, not only his manner of speech and facial expression had changed, but he also worked hard and even fulfilled his promise. The blue-haired man thought, did he really want to see these people smile? It was impossible. He was not that kind of person. The innkeeper and his mother were smiling. Xavier smiled and thought that he saw how happy they were. A system window appeared that Xavier's interest level had increased by 2 points and was now at -29. Lloyd smiled. He looked around and said that he probably thought he wasn't such a piece of trash. He said no. The hero said he thought he was right. The guy smiled and thought that in any case the first order was completed, and even though he was in the red, it didn't matter. He thought it was because he had built this little house for advertising. A few days later, many people were standing in line. The man came out of the house and said he thought it would melt. Lloyd slapped the table and asked how he was. Wasn't it hot? Wouldn't he like a room like that in his house too? He handed over a sheet of paper and said that Model A was a separate building in the yard and Model B was a remodel of the house. If he signed both orders, he would get a 10% discount. The man shrank back and began to refuse. A system window appeared that the villager did not trust Lloyd. He said that they would see each other often, which meant they should trust each other. He leaned over and asked if he really didn't believe him. For such a price, it was just a gift. The guy looked away when someone called out to him. His father looked at him and asked what he was doing here. A system window appeared that his interest level was -20. Lloyd frowned. Frontera mansion. The hero was sitting at a long dining table opposite his father. The guy glanced at him furtively and thought that he had been carefully avoiding him, afraid that the head of the family would forbid construction. The man calmly cut the sausage. The young man frowned when his father said that he was ready to listen to him. Arcus frowned and asked what he had come up with this time. The guy brought a fork with food and replied that the innkeeper had ordered floor heating, and he had fulfilled it. He decided to avoid long explanations and act according to his character. The interlocutor looked at him and added that his son was now making contracts with other residents. The hero nodded. The man frowned and said that the residents were very important and valuable, and he would not forgive the boy if he deceived them. Lloyd closed his eyes and replied that he didn't have to worry about that. As the boy had expected, no matter what he did, no one believed him. The boy got up from the table and said that he was leaving since his father had nothing more to say. The hero tried to run away as quickly as possible. Arcus closed his eyes and assumed that his son was doing this because of the situation in their family. He frowned and assured him that he could quickly deal with such a trifle himself, so the boy didn't have to interfere. Lloyd turned around and looked at him sadly. He had heard these words before. His father had assured him the same thing in his past life, convincing him that the main thing was to study and not worry. The hero really thought that everything was fine. The brown-haired man pressed his lips together and thought that it was a lie, that nothing was right. He didn't want to become pathetic because of someone's lousy money. He moved towards the exit and asked his father not to give up, because the boy would try too. A few years ago, when the hero had to say these words to his father, the boy was walking down the corridor and calculating that he had received 32 orders for Model and 57 orders for Model B. The hero had already received almost half of the deposit. He stopped when he saw two men in front of him. They were the loan sharks Shalo and Meatloaf. They passed by, and the young man was surprised that these two even greeted the Baron's son. The hero frowned, and an idea struck him. The guests entered Arcus's office. One of them sat down leisurely on the edge of the table and asked how long the man would delay payment. The fat man added that more than 5 days had already passed, and if he continued to delay payments like this, they would not sit idly by. The Baron frowned and looked down. Shalo looked at him with disdain and said that if he sold the items in the house, the money would appear. The protagonist cautiously peered through the door. He smirked and mentally noted that it was timely. The guy grinned and thought that they appeared when needed. RP amount, 36. The young man looked at the system window and noted that he received some points by improving his relationship with Xavier. It remained to figure out where to use them. Notification: by investing the received points in talent, you can improve your abilities. The guy looked at the screen in surprise and noted that the messenger still knows how to explain normally. Next message: damn, I will not explain. The hero hastened to apologize. Suddenly, a circle lit up under Lloyd's feet. It began to rise higher up the young man's body. Knowledge: soil mechanics, hydrology, structural mechanics, water supply system, design of steel and concrete structures, the highest level of design. The system wrote that the hero, surprisingly, knows a lot. The brown-haired man frowned and shouted that he definitely needed to get a word in. Notification: possible improvement of knowledge-based skills. Topographic survey, base, required number of points 15. Design, base, required number of points 15. The guy crossed his arms and thought that it was not entirely clear what and how, but there was enough RP and he could try. He clicked on both options. Skill name: topographic survey, base. His eyes suddenly began to glow, and the hero leaned out the window with a scream. The young man saw a virtual grid for design in front of him. Lloyd was surprised that even without using GPS he could calculate everything, just seeing everything with his own eyes. Skill name: design, base. The brown-haired man began to draw a diagram of the house right in the air in front of him. Just recently he had suffered, drawing a project on a piece of paper. The hero sat down on the bed and thought that in the future, of course, it would be much easier for him, but would Xavier's help alone be enough? The guy raised an eyebrow and dreamed that it would be nice to summon heavy equipment. The system reported that there was something to summon. The young man looked at the screen in shock. Random phantom selection. Using RP, you can summon a phantom. Different capabilities, different skills. Choose a phantom partner who will try his best for you in everything. The hero noted that this looked like an advertisement for the game. He squinted and saw on the screen that one phantom choice 50 RP. Lloyd frowned and realized that he was not enough, only 1 point remained. The brown-haired man thoughtfully touched his chin and imagined that the phantom could be a mythical animal like a dragon or a unicorn. In this case, their strength would be equal to the strength of heavy equipment. The guy frowned and decided that he needed to collect RP, and to do this he needed to get the interest of the main characters. Meatloaf slammed his hand on the table and, looking at the Baron, said that he could suggest one way if he didn't have a penny. He grinned and said that a man could sell his wife and children and get good money. Arcus looked at his interlocutor in shock and asked again. The hero said that he should maintain the boundaries of decency even if he was a creditor. The guy put his hand on the fat guest's shoulder. The man recoiled and asked who he was. The father looked at the young man in confusion and said his name. Meatloaf narrowed his eyes and muttered that he was that special naughty eldest son who butted into adults' conversations. He wanted to threaten the guy to leave, but he interrupted him. The hero extended his hand and demanded to see the invitation letter first. The moneylenders shuddered in surprise. Lloyd bowed his head and said that the fundamental law of the kingdom, Chapter 3, Article 6, states that all aristocracy are subjects of the king and have the right to protect their interests. He looked menacingly at the guests and declared that entering the residence of the aristocracy without an invitation letter is considered an intrusion, and this is contained in the law. The interlocutors got angry and shouted that this was nonsense. The young man raised an eyebrow and suggested that they all check together for the presence of the law. The guy frowned and called Xavier. The knight entered the room and greeted the gentleman. The hero bared his teeth and ordered that the intruder's hand be cut off. The swordsman silently grabbed the handle of the weapon. The guests backed away in fear and shouted that they had completely lost their minds. The brown-haired man raised his chin and suggested that they check again whose side the court would take. Xavier threateningly bared his blade. The moneylenders began to sweat and looked at him in fear. The men quickly headed for the exit, shouting that they would make him regret it. The door quickly slammed behind them. Lloyd chuckled and called them worthless. The Baron turned to the boys and they looked at him. The man jumped up and asked what they had just done in a situation where they had to beg on their knees. The boy silently put the bag on the table. The boy smiled and said that he had originally wanted to get the entire deposit and give it back, but this amount was also enough to pay this month's interest. The father looked at him in shock and asked if this was really the money collected from the villagers. The knight closed his eyes and asked the Baron not to worry. He looked at the owner and promised that he would make sure that the boy fulfilled the terms of the contract. Arcus looked closely at the swordsman and thought that his expression showed that he completely trusted him. Lloyd bowed and said that in that case they would go. The boys walked down the corridor. Xavier glanced sideways at the master and said that he did not expect the fool to know such laws. The interlocutor frowned and exclaimed that he had simply heard it somewhere. In general, it was true. Xavier himself told about it in the novel. After the Baron and his wife committed suicide, 2 moneylenders wanted to dig up the bodies and sell them. Then the knight voiced this law. Saying these words, he cut their necks. In court, the guy was completely acquitted. The hero closed his eyes with satisfaction and thought that it was a big plus to know the contents of the novel. The young man smiled and noted that a notification should have arrived by now. Notification: Baron Frontera's interest has increased by 6 points. By improving relations with the main character, you receive 60 RP, quantity 61. Lloyd smiled that everything happened as he planned to get the Phantom as soon as possible. The moon was shining in the night sky. The hero was standing on the training ground. He looked around to make sure there was no one around. The guy looked at the system window and applied a random drawing of fantastic creatures. The young man pressed the button and looked at the glow in front of him. Gears were spinning in the air. Lloyd looked up in shock at the sight of such magic. A magic circle was hanging in front of him. The brown-haired man turned pale and thought that this spell was very weak and small. It just made an annoying noise. Something lit up from the magic circle, after which a mouse's head appeared. The aristocrat stared at it in shock. The animal jumped to the ground and looked at the guy. He silently looked at the mouse and grimaced in disappointment. The creature looked at its new owner in fear, after which it began to squeak loudly. The hero turned to him and asked if he could do a lot of things. Shooting acorns was not what he needed. The mouse waved its paws, refuting what the master had said. The guy asked to show him what it could do. The little animal began to chew something vigorously, after which it spat out 2 pieces of paper. The hero unfolded them with disgust and read the contents. It turned out that the creature Peepodong was a cute hamster, which the system asked to take care of with love. He shook out sunflower seeds into his palm. It was said that they could change the structure of the animal. Red sunflower seed: Peepodong will become huge, the effect will disappear in 12 hours. Blue sunflower seed: Peepodong will become small, feed this seed to the hamster before the effect of the red seed ends. The young man looked at the paper and read that a set of 2 seeds costs 1 RP. He looked at the hamster and asked if it grows to the size of a human. Peepodong squeaked in response, and the hero realized that he needed to check for himself. The boy gave the hamster a seed and thought that the animal should be good at digging and could be useful if it became the size of a human. Peepodong began to chew the seed. The aristocrat looked in surprise as it began to glow and increase in size. Something pushed the hero, and he flew back. Lloyd stared at him in shock and turned pale. A 5-meter hamster stood in front of him. No, it was at least 10 meters. Peepodong looked at his owner with disdain. Peepodong skill: digging level 1. The animal began to dig actively, leaving a ditch behind it. Peepodong skill: strengthening the earth level 1. The hamster rolled over on its back and began to compact the soil. Peepodong skill: puffing out its cheeks level 1. The animal puffed out its cheeks and spat out a boulder. The stone plopped down in front of the hero. The young man smiled and was glad that the problem with the heavy equipment was solved. Lloyd walked down the corridor, his hands in his pockets. He wondered if people would be suspicious if the guy suddenly showed up with this magical creature. The hero grinned and decided that he would carry a summoning book with him and tell everyone that he was a genius summoner. The nobleman looked ahead and remembered that it was time to solve the problem with workers for a large-scale construction project. The next day, the young man stood in front of a group of people with shovels and ordered them to repeat after him. He squeezed the handle of the tool and shouted that safety was above all. The 30-man Frontera barony army looked at the gentleman absent-mindedly and sluggishly repeated the phrase. The brown-haired man smiled tensely and thought that these guys looked like soldiers who were paid but did not work. He was surprised that they had not been dispersed yet, considering that the Baron had a lot of debt. The boy smiled and pointed out that that was why they wouldn't get any overtime bonuses. It was good that they had manpower. Lloyd frowned and shouted that they were soldiers, and when they got together, they were an army. The hero threw his shovel over his shoulder and said that their essence was to complete tasks. The young man remembered that when he was in the army, they did more digging and weeding than trading. The nobleman pointed to a pile of earth and said that he dug it up after working all night. In fact, Peepodong dug it all up in half an hour. The brown-haired man put his hand on his belt and shouted that the first task was to revive the estate. This was a boiler room project for the people of the estate. To make it, the soldiers had to move the earth to the construction site. The man looked at the master with disappointment. The hero had expected them to react like that. Someone came up behind him and called out. The senior knight of the Newman barony looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he had ordered his men to do. Lloyd smirked and thought that he had expected the man to speak up. There were 3 knights in this estate: Newman, his subordinate Bairn, and the protagonist of the novel, Xavier Asraha. At the beginning of the novel, only Bairn and Xavier remained loyal until the fall of the estate. The senior knight looked at the boy with displeasure. It was this man who had been the first to betray and abandon the Baron. Since it was Newman who had sold information about the Baron to swindlers, he owed a hefty debt. The hero looked at the swordsman with disdain and wondered how such a man could even be the senior knight. The young man looked at his interlocutor with a grin and asked him what he thought they were doing. The man frowned and said that he could not believe that an aristocrat was forcing the militia to do dirty work. He added that, as the head of the knights, he could not tolerate this. The guy leaned on the shovel and thought it was nonsense because the hero was earning money to pay off his debts. He said that he had obtained the Baron's permission. The knight stood opposite the aristocrat. Newman said that he did not know how the young man had outwitted his lord, but offered to recall the young master's past. The man frowned and suggested that his interlocutor was using the militia forces for personal gain. The brown-haired man closed his eyes, then smiled and replied that he was right. The hero glared menacingly at the swordsman and warned that he would get it now. The warrior's face instantly distorted with anger and irritation. Just think about his weak self-control. If the knight had tried to play an online game, he would have exploded in a minute. Lloyd pulled the tool out of the ground and, swinging, threw sand at his interlocutor. The soldiers stared at them in shock. The man covered his eyes with his hand in displeasure, and the brown-haired man only grinned. The swordsman was shaking with anger. He looked at the young man angrily and was indignant that he had really tried to tarnish the knight's reputation. In his mind, Newman called him the stupid son of a nearly bankrupt baron. The hero put his hand to his ear and asked if his interlocutor really wanted to throw away his regalia and fight. The guy swung his shovel and pointed it at the warrior. Lloyd smiled and suggested a duel. The flushed man raised his eyebrows and warned that the young man would regret it. Frontera Estate. The hero was going to duel Newman in a month. Xavier looked at the gentleman and asked if he was so sure of his victory. The aristocrat was sitting on the bed, crossing his legs. He looked at the knight and exclaimed that he was not. The boy added that his opponent was a knight called the Heart of Mana and a junior sword expert, and he himself was just a lazybones. Naturally, he was not up to fighting him. The young man asked if the other man had even thought about it before asking such a question. Xavier frowned in irritation and squeezed the hilt of his sword. Then the warrior loosened his grip and noted that he had almost cut down the gentleman. He looked at the hero picking his nose and could not believe that he had suddenly thrown dirt at the Newman knight and even asked for a duel. Perhaps the young man wanted to be a scoundrel again. However, the boy himself asked the Baron for a favor, then entered into an argument and pushed Xavier away. By this time, he had appointed Knight Baron as a temporary manager and was in charge of the construction team. However, the young man was unsure about this duel. The brown-haired man pulled a booger out of his nose, and the other man immediately wanted to hack him to death. The hero wiped his hands and said that the knight had to do something. The young man smiled and asked to be taught how to handle a sword. The other man frowned and said that he did not want to. The aristocrat looked at him with disappointment and asked why. The swordsman replied that, first of all, it was his duty to protect the young master. The blonde man looked calmly at Lloyd and added that he was like a sack, and if a sack learned fencing, it would be even more dangerous to be around him. The aristocrat asked to at least speak more softly. The brown-haired man once again clarified whether the knight really did not want to teach him. The hero smiled confidently and said that he would deal with his insomnia in exchange. Xavier looked at the gentleman in shock, not understanding how he knew about it. The young man grinned and thought that, thanks to the novel, he also knew the reason for his insomnia. In the work The Knight of Iron and Blood, knights are divided into 4 levels by rank: Sword Master, Supreme Sword Expert, Middle Sword Expert, Junior Sword Expert. Xavier's level is Supreme Sword Expert, and he will soon become a Master Sword Master. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called Sword Master Syndrome. The brown-haired man leaned on his hands and thought that in the countryside they do not know such things, so the knight himself does not know either. The hero looked at his interlocutor and asked if he agreed to the deal, because it was written on his face that he had insomnia. Xavier sighed and replied that he would try. The nobleman smiled and asked him not to give in to him. The swordsman chuckled and said that he was saying this because the young man would definitely fail. He had tried many things to cure his insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatherapy, exercise, oriental medicine, and the like, The knight was sleeping peacefully in a chair, hugging a pillow. The protagonist stood in front of him and chuckled that he knew exactly how to cure insomnia. The 18th magic technique is reading a manual on reinforced concrete structures. This is what puts you to sleep. The guy grinned and thought that all the swordsman's skills would now be his. The sun was shining in the sky. The refreshed and well-rested knight looked at the master and ordered him to run 50 laps. The hero looked at the warrior in surprise and turned around and ran. The swordsman turned to look at the master and was amazed that he ran without complaint. Lloyd was running circles around the training ground. He ran up to the knight and muttered in a tired voice that he hated it and was eager to learn something. After these words, the guy ran on. Having completed the next circle, the hero smiled at his interlocutor and asked if he expected that the aristocrat would not be able to and would whine. The warrior continued to watch the gentleman running circles. At the next turn, the sweaty guy exclaimed that the knight would have simply said that the young man was not cut out for it and waved him off. Javier shuddered, because the interlocutor guessed right. The brown-haired man ran on with a laugh, shouting that he would run to the end. Notification: passive skill ugliness increased to level 4. Anyone who sees you will take you for a freak and will feel the desire to punch you. The young man got angry and exclaimed that he did not have such a skill. The hero was sweating and breathing heavily. It would be a lie to say that he was not tired. However, this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning the boy opened his eyes in a crowded Gishiwan. Every day he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night the boy loaded trucks with boxes just to not die of hunger, always dreaming that someday it would get better. The young man encouraged himself that he was doing well, was qualified, and there was still a little bit left. But the light he was reaching for suddenly went out, and the hero was left alone with the darkness. Compared to that pain and despair, this was nothing. Lloyd ran under the moonlight and smiled. The knight continued to stand nearby. He looked closely at the master and thought that he would teach him his fencing technique if the aristocrat was so sincere. The brown-haired man continued to turn circles. Notification: Xavier's opinion of you has increased by +1. His opinion of you is -28. You have received 18 RP for slightly improving your relationship with a key character. Score: 29 RP. The manor was illuminated by the moon. The Baron sat at the table and looked at Newman standing in front of him. The man could not believe that his son would be so rude to the one who had protected their family for 5 generations. Arcus leaned on his hands and muttered that he thought the boy had come to his senses, but he must have misunderstood him. He looked at the swordsman and said that it was his moral duty not to interfere with the duel. Still, the Baron asked him not to be too cruel to the heir to the estate. The Lord looked at his interlocutor intently and ordered that the boy be brought to his senses, but not crippled. Newman bowed and accepted the request. The knight smirked and thought that he did not know if he could do it during the duel. He walked down the corridor, determined to kill this arrogant bastard. And if the Baron made a big deal out of it, he would destroy him and the Baroness too and pass it off as suicide. The swordsman smiled and thought that, as planned, he would then leave this village for a better place. Thanks to the young master, his plan was coming to fruition faster than he expected. A month passed. Spectators gathered around the training ground to watch the nobleman and the knight standing opposite each other. The protagonist's parents were sitting under the canopy, looking nervous, while Xavier and Baron stood behind them. The man raised his sword and asked if his opponent was ready. The boy took a step forward and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, answered in the affirmative. He smiled confidently and advised his opponent to get ready to rake in the dirt. While the young man stood there grinning, the people around him were discussing the fact that the gentleman would be fighting Newman with a shovel. The blonde gritted his teeth in anger. Xavier looked down at the hero and noticed that the metal shovel had been ordered from a blacksmith. Arcus covered his face with his hand and muttered that his son was an idiot who thought this was some kind of joke. The knight looked at the sight carefully and thought that if he remembered what the young man had been doing for the past month, it might not be a joke. The gentleman did general exercises early in the morning without complaining, then went to the construction site to explain the boiler room to the village engineers, and after that, trained with a sword until he wanted to sleep. This did not look like a man who was just joking. Xavier frowned, sure that the young gentleman was serious. The Baron raised his hand and announced that the duel between Lloyd Frontera and the knight Newman was about to begin. The man took a fighting stance, and the boy grabbed the shovel with a grin. Xavier frowned, not understanding what kind of stupid stance this was. The blonde attacked first, outraged by his opponent's behavior. The brown-haired man swung the shovel and easily blocked his opponent's blow. The father and the swordsman standing behind him stared at the duelists in surprise. Newman swung again and thought that the young man would not be lucky a second time. However, this attack was also blocked by the young gentleman. Xavier's eyes widened and he realized that this incredible and effective technique was used in real battles, as if his swordsmanship had suddenly improved after so many years. The opponent began to sweat and looked warily at Lloyd. The young man grinned and thought that there was nothing surprising in this, because in Korea every man could do this. This is a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. He lunged with the shovel, and the opponent recoiled in fear. The hero covered himself with the tool, using it as a shield. Then he made another lunge with the tip, but the man dodged. The young man thrust the weapon into the ground and, laughing, began to jump on it. Xavier sweated and wondered if the aristocrat was really joking. The sweaty guy continued to laugh, but his gaze remained confident. The watching knight tried to understand his plan. Newman ran up to attack with a cry. The brown-haired man took a fighting stance and thought that the first thing he had prepared for the enemy was a shovel, and the second was the basic fencing that Xavier had taught him. The young man fought off the attacks and gradually pushed the enemy back. The man clenched his teeth in irritation, not understanding when the drunkard and scum had become so strong. The third thing the hero had prepared was this, a synchronized skill for handling a tool. Digging, level 1. Become one with the shovel, body and soul. The level of synchronization between you and your shovel will increase. The guy swung, and his tool began to glow. Xavier's opinion of the hero increased by +1 during the training. And the Baron and Baroness, who saw their son's sincerity for the first time in their lives, had it increased by +2 and +3. They accumulated 97 RP, which allowed them to purchase an additional skill for 40 points. Then the hero realized that he had learned a pretty cool skill. He looked closely at his opponent. The man exhaled and swung his sword. Newman thought that he had no choice. It was unlikely that this should be used against an ordinary person, but he wanted to. A glow began to emanate from his body. Xavier narrowed his eyes. The enemy was pumping up mana. The brown-haired man frowned, realizing this. The enemy was about to use a mana heart. The mustachioed man grabbed the handle and, frowning, declared that now everything was serious. The young man did not answer, and the opponent rushed at him. The knight watching them frowned and thought that someone who had not had any talents for 10 years, even the most ordinary ones, would need at least 5 years to master the mana heart. The young master would not be able to block such an attack. The man swung his blade. The boy held the shovel in front of him, but the enemy only grinned, confident that he would cut it in half and break the aristocrat's skull. The protagonist's parents jerked in horror, and the woman covered her mouth with her hands. The blow hit the shovel, but it did not flinch. Newman stared ahead in shock. He felt like all his strength was leaking out. Lloyd smirked and thought that this was the fourth skill he had prepared, Mana Mastery, which made Xavier the strongest man in the novel. The knight watched the duel closely. Mana flowed into the boy's body through the weapon. This was the technique of the Asrahan core. The man recoiled in fear and exclaimed that his mana had been drained. At that moment, the hero swung and hit his opponent in the face with a shovel. A broken tooth flew against the blue sky, which its owner looked at sadly. Lloyd's next blow was to the chin with the opposite end of the tool. The boy looked down at the swordsman with an ominous look and hit him hard on the head. Newman fell flat on the ground at his feet. All the spectators widened their eyes in shock. They saw the knight lying in front of the boy, but they could not believe that the young master had won. Arcus raised his hand in confusion and announced that Lloyd Frontera had won the duel. The blonde was lying on the ground and did not understand how such a master of the sword could lose to the scum. The aristocrat came closer and, throwing the shovel over his shoulder, said that the man had been beaten. The hero swung and said that it was time for the long-awaited punishment. The man looked up in fear. The Baron jumped up and shouted that the duel was already over. The young man began to beat the enemy with a shovel. Arcus frowned and shouted his son's name in rage. The knights immediately began to hold the protagonist so that he would stop hitting Newman with a shovel. Bayern stood next to Xavier at this time and looked at what was happening with an angry expression, suggesting that the protagonist had gone crazy. At this time, Xavier looked ahead with sadness and realized that Lloyd could have lost his mind. The protagonist at this time waved his hands and sighed heavily, because he ordered to let him go because he had calmed down. Then he put the shovel on the ground and his hands on his belt, sighing with relief. Then he started hitting his opponent with the shovel again and they tried to restrain him again. Xavier looked through his bangs with displeasure and realized, if you look closely, he was hitting him so as not to hurt him too much. At this time, the blonde with a mustache screamed from the blows. The brown-haired man at this time looked at his opponent angrily, but Xavier saw this calm expression on his face because he seemed to know in advance what would happen next and as if he already knew everything. At this time, the guy with blue hair looked ahead coldly. In his memories, 15 days before the duel, the brown-haired man leaned his hand on the blade and wanted to learn the Azarakan technique of the mind. At that moment, Xavier looked at him in surprise, and the brown-haired man did not understand such a reaction because he asked to teach him something good and not stealing. It was a silhouette of a man who absorbed the aura streams, because in addition to the assimilated mana, it can attract mana from what surrounds him and transform it into his mana. At that moment, the knight looked at him intently and asked the master how he knew this, because he understood that he had always kept this technique a secret because it was still not complete. Lloyd looked at his teacher with wide eyes and said that he helped him fall asleep, and Xavier talked about it in his sleep. At this time, the main character with a malicious grin and a masked face looked at the teacher, who understood that it was only his imagination that now imagined him with an iron mask on his face. The blue-haired guy looked intently at the brown-haired man, who threw his sword behind his head, and to his regret, said that he could not teach him this technique because it was still not complete. The main character raised his eyebrows with irony, asking if he could complete it, would he be trained? Xavier looked at him with disdain and said if he said so, then perhaps it would be so, but he was embarrassed by this self-confident look. Then Lloyd stuck his sword into the ground. He looked at his hands and tried to insert a finger into his fist, assuming that his mana heart was absorbing mana from outside by itself. Then he was about to hit his fist on his palm and assumed that it bounced off as a result, and as he saw, from the point of view of his heart, external mana is something foreign. Then it was a silhouette of a man with outstretched arms, who absorbed streams of aura, because he wanted to change the source, the which he absorbs from outside will not mix with the mana heart. It was a glowing core with pulses of light, because he ordered to let it gather separately. This ball of light began to sparkle and emit streams, because it needed to be rolled up and used. The brown-haired man began to rotate his finger near his fist with a grin and explained that it was like an auxiliary engine near the main engine, because they were one whole, but at the same time worked separately, and it should be great. Xavier looked at him with displeasure and explained that he was sure that it was possible, but did not understand where Lloyd came from before such reasoning. Then the main character stretched out his hands in front of his face, on which there was an iron mask, because he said that he simply imagined. Xavier saw this expression and assumed that he clearly knew something, but just did not show it. The protagonist looked at how his teacher stretched his hands to the sides and began to emit streams of light and aura, because he managed to complete the Astrakhan technique of the mind, which had been bothering him for a long time. It was a blue core that emitted pulses of light around itself, because over the time of his first attempt, the number of contours that he could create increased to 3, and if he trained more, he could reach 4 or even 5 contours. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of Lloyd had increased by +5. The protagonist opened his mouth and bulged his eyes in amazement. He was surprised how much he had been taught the mana heart technique, because he didn't need it, because he only wanted to learn part of the absorption, and he didn't need the mana around him, but only the one he touched. Young Mr. Lloyd had such an ability, so Xavier expected that he would defeat the Knight Newman. At that time, the guys were trying to restrain the protagonist, who was bloodthirstily trying to finish off the lying fighter, and triumphantly. At that time, the protagonist's father was furious, hitting the table with his hands, because he did not want to allow him to ruin the knight's reputation any longer. Arcus watched his enraged son being restrained. At this time, the brown-haired man was sweating and trying to catch his breath when he heard about the knight's reputation. Then he pointed a finger at his father in displeasure and told him to look under the tablecloth before he decided whether these words were appropriate for Nikita's knight. A pile of sealed letters lay on the table under a white coverlet. Arcus looked at these letters in horror. While Newman lay writhing in pain, the brown-haired man looked at his father and said that towards who was causing harm to the Baron's estate, and a letter from this scoundrel Knight Newman. Arcus convulsively opened his mouth, holding the letter, because Lloyd explained that it was the furnishings of the estate. What the Baron liked and did not like, and instructions on how to forge property documents, and in these letters everything that they managed to share. The protagonist looked at the agitated Newman with a cold face, not understanding how he found the letters he hid inside the walls. At this time, the protagonist smiled maliciously and said that in the novel, Xavier found them later. He remembered how his little beast Peapadon went to get the letters last night. The father sat down on the chair in horror, looking at the table with the letters. Then he looked at his son, who was staring at him, and realized, as expected, that in the novel he was described as a kind person, because it would be a big fuss if he were to kill him now. Then he closed his lips with a dissatisfied grin and realized that the words kind ruler and good ruler meant completely different things. The protagonist looked at all the nobles at the table, and realized that if his father was so worried about how to get rid of this man, then he could offer him something. At this time, the brown-haired man was holding his shovel, while Newman was on the ground, looking at him with excitement. Newman heard that they wanted to put an angry rat on his head, and then expel him from the estate, wounded by rats, and if not, then they would demote him to an ordinary soldier and give him a chance to atone for his sins. At this time, the rest of the people were frightened by such a statement, because they understood that it sounded inhuman. Arcus at this time, his eyes bulged in surprise and understood that in order to carry out justice for a minor offense, he would be given a chance to atone, but with a warning of a more severe punishment. Bayern stood next to Xavier and frowned, saying that it was a wise and generous decision and a good warning to others. The protagonist looked at the nobles who sat on the platform, and they agreed to do as he suggested. At this time, the knight with a mustache, without raising his head, said that he had no objections, because he had just been shown mercy. The protagonist looked at him puzzled and tried to understand what kind of mercy. He imagined how a black silhouette of a man sat on a rug in front of his king, and Lloyd understood if he would treat the criminals kindly and whether they would atone for their sins for the forgiveness granted to them. But he realized that this would not happen. Then his black silhouette laughed maliciously, because he realized that in this case they would become more decisive and strong-willed and would try to take advantage of their kindness. At this time, Newman grinned angrily and realized that they would regret this decision, because he would definitely take revenge on this upstart. Newman looked discontentedly from under his brows at the protagonist, who was glad of his smile, and it was a pity that it would be his last. The beaten knight looked at his opponent in bewilderment and asked him to repeat. Then the main character gave a seed to his hamster. Then he threw this beast high into the sun. Lloyd looked at Newman with bloodthirsty arrogance and declared what the best way to ask for forgiveness was, hinting that there was none. At this time, the hamster was deliciously devouring the seed. Then he began to increase in size. The blonde, along with Arcus, looked at what was happening in amazement. Bayern, along with Andri, were also scared and opened their mouths in horror. The rest of the crowd of people bulged their eyes in shock from the black shadow. It was the same hamster that had grown in size. Newman's eyes widened in horror, his mouth opened because the hamster was about to fall on him. This huge pet was flying from the sky with its entire body towards Newman. At that time, the protagonist stood with his back to Newman, his hand on his belt, and there was a bang. The huge hamster was lying on the ground, having crushed the knight. The brown-haired man raised his finger up with a malicious smile and understood that such people should be driven out, because this would solve the problem with the rotten man inside the estate forever. It was a huge mountain plain with fields. At that time, Peepodong was throwing the earth. This hamster was throwing it in all directions. Peepodong was digging a ditch along the entire street of the city. The brown-haired man looked at him with a grin, while Xavier tried to understand what his beast was doing. Lloyd replied that he was getting ready to widen the road. They were tired and excited workers who were carrying materials and bags. Then moments later they immediately became pumped up and angry with sweat because they suddenly turned into brave craftsmen. It was a beautiful white tile laid in a path. Lloyd explained that in ancient times there was such a city as Rome, and its inhabitants loved roads very much, because they built a special road system called the Opmc way. The main character looked at the teacher with a grin from under his bangs and said that they would now start from the Baron's house and extend the road to the eastern slope. The protagonist was about to leave, putting his hand in his pockets, while Xavier looked cold-blooded and tried to understand why exactly the road, to which Lloyd replied that he himself would soon see everything. Xavier stared at the grin of his comrade, who said because the popularity of their village would skyrocket. Then the main character looked back with an exclamation when he was asked about where he learned all this. The main character looked at him intently, because Xavier asked about how he came up with the idea of a heating system that they had never heard of before. And he also suddenly learned to summon something from the Vey, and all this looks like high-level magic. The blue-haired knight looked at him with disdain and asked if he was really their master. A red message popped up about the danger that Xavier doubted him. The smooth character looked at him, bulging his eyes. Xavier looked cold-blooded and calm. The brown-haired man threw the shovel over his shoulder and thought with a sullen grin about when he read about this man in the novel. He already knew that he was a capable person and would be able to easily guess if a stranger entered the body of the Baron's son. The embittered knight was immediately going to pull out his blade, because this guy is not to be trifled with, but there is no reason to worry because he has a special skill for such cases. Lloyd twisted his face in horror, his eyes wide, because he studied in secret from everyone and assumed that he could do it. A notification with a special skill of persistence popped up. Lloyd anxiously squeezed his body, approached the teacher, who told him that the young gentleman drank all day long. Lloyd realized that he was being watched every hour of the day, and maybe he used to be a real scoundrel, but he did not know anything about what he was doing all this time. Xavier indifferently looked away and asked how he could explain the skills of a spellcaster, because even a mage with a lot of experience sometimes cannot do this. Xavier stared at the brown-haired man next to him, who was excited, trying to justify himself, and asked him the answer to the question, how did he cope with mana himself? Although he was barely over 20, because no one taught him either, and he should be a genius, but Xavier did not consider himself one. Lloyd opened his mouth in horror even more, because he asked there, could he be a genius, why the teacher did not consider himself as such, because he assumed that he suddenly became a genius spellcaster. Xavier looked at him intently with sweat on his brow and did not trust. The knight watched as Lloyd immediately turned around with displeasure and began to leave, adding in pursuit that if he had nothing more to say, then he would go, because he still had things to do. Notification that there were with a special skill of fast conversation and persistence. The brown-haired man continued to walk forward and tried to calm down, because he realized that Xavier began to suspect him. Then on the way he met Bayern, while the workers were sorting out the bags, and asked him to monitor the progress of the work while he was gone. The knight in the coat replied that everything would be done and there was nothing to worry about. Then the brown-haired man looked back in surprise at the blue-haired knight, who wanted to go with him because it was his duty to protect the young gentleman. Lloyd said with irony that such obvious things should not be said at all, because he would definitely go with him, and the knight asked about the way. Xavier began to follow the gentleman, who threw the shovel over his shoulder and looked happy because he answered that they were going to one place in the footsteps of an unpaid debt. The setting sunset behind the mountain enveloped a small remote town in the Rodinia estate. There was a sign with the inn's name. At this time, the man angrily hit the table with his fist and was indignant. They were transported to the house of the swindler Thords, who looked agitated and embittered because he had lost all his money and wanted to make all the scoundrels pay. At this time, a large guy in a black coat towered over him and asked if this was not the essence of gambling, since he himself earned money in this way. The brunette with a scar looked at the swindler with displeasure and said that since he had such a body, then if he was not able to pay for his services, then he would leave him immediately. Thords looked at the assistant with horror and said that he could pay and would even give him more, so he ordered him to stay near him. His comrade in a black suit said that he would go immediately if he did not receive payment on time. The swindler indignantly grabbed his head and said that he could only earn money by deceiving others, but now too many people would want to settle scores with him, so it was worth lying low for a while. Suddenly, the main character burst into their house with a kick and realized that they were talking about him. Lloyd entered this room, as the swindler immediately jumped up from such impudence. Lloyd looked at him with an echidna mulka and realized that he had not seen him. The main character looked at him maliciously through his bangs and introduced himself by his name. Thords with great horror bulged his eyes and opened his mouth. Thords immediately put his hand on his assistant in black, who offered his help, but the swindler wanted to leave here faster. His assistant immediately bent over the ground, grabbing his master. Then they quickly jumped out of the house through the window. This man in a black suit was about to land on the ground. The man with a scar on his face became angry with discontent. Xavier at this time cut his blade near the shoulder. The knight immediately swung his sword in the air. The knight in blue walked down the street with his sword, ordered to give him the swindler and leave himself, and then they will not touch him. Xavier looked at him through his bangs and realized that he had done everything as the young gentleman had said. The big guy in the black suit looked at the man who had blocked his way with displeasure, who knew that they would try to escape through the window, which was why he had waited here. The guy in the suit frowned with displeasure. Then the guy immediately bloodthirstily stretched out his hand with a black magic core and joked about whether the knight even knew how to handle his blade. At this time, the brown-haired man looked through the broken window in surprise and realized that after the death of the bear, Xavier had longed for together because he had fought with the personal guard of Thords, the swindler whose trail he had managed to attack. Xavier watched as the black mage emitted streams of dark energy because this was his first battle with a dark mage. The knight immediately sat down on the ground, baring his teeth from such pressure and holding onto his sword because it was not easy for him and he had to resist the magic of gravity. Lloyd smiled maliciously because everything was just like in the novel. The dark mage sent a stream of black core towards the knight. Xavier managed to put out his blade to reflect the attack. This black aura tried to surround him from all sides. He immediately found himself in a purple core with dark matter. The dark mage with a grin frowned, stretching out his palm, because he understood that it was predetermined and Xavier must die. A huge fist immediately flew at him. The knight pressed himself to the ground with his feet and tried to convulsively hold the blade. The dark magician looked at what was happening with bewilderment and a sullen grin, because in the novel Xavier fought the scoundrel, being only a simple weapons specialist. The blue-haired knight looked furiously at his opponent with a core in his chest. It was a blue ball that studied matter along the axis, because the real Xavier has a heart of mana triple ring. He immediately swung his sword and cut the barrier. The knight looked away in confusion and tried to understand what it was, whether it was magic that controls gravity. At this time, Dark Max with a drooping look stretched out his fist in the sweat of his brow. The dark magician immediately soared into the sky to escape, but Thords was indignant at such a fate. Xavier immediately went to the swindler, who stretched out his hands in fear because they wanted him for his deception of honest people. The swindler immediately flew into the wooden barrels. The knight arrogantly raised his blade over the scoundrel and said that he would cut off his legs so that he could only crawl into court. He immediately tried to cut the air with his blade. The main character immediately stood in his way with an agitated look. Lloyd immediately began to furiously shout that Xavier had gone crazy, because if he got to court in such a state, then punishment awaited him. The blue-haired knight immediately wilted and was surprised. The main character looked angrily from under his brows at his knight, who did not understand why his master showed sympathy for others. Deep night stood over the city on the mountain plain. At this time, the swindler was tied to chairs and looked ahead with an agitated look. Lloyd sat with folded hands opposite the swindler with a lost look. Then the brown-haired man waved his hand with a smile and asked Thords not to be afraid. The con man looked excitedly at the protagonist, who stated that when life is at stake, people tend to be greedy, and they will do anything when they get the chance. The protagonist sat opposite him, smiling, leaning on his hands, and stated that cutting off his head would be too cruel. The con man suggested that they were ready to forgive him, but he received a mocking answer that his secret would be taken to the grave. Lloyd smiled animatedly, closing his eyes and leaning his head on his fingers, asking Thords if he was grateful to him, because if so, why not give him all the money back? The con man began to smile with an ironic grin, and said that first he needed to be forgiven. The protagonist continued to look at him with a smile, closed his eyes, and said that he would receive forgiveness, because that was the meaning of their existence. The con man raised his eyebrows and looked at the protagonist in surprise. Then Tully excitedly exclaimed when the protagonist began to take out a piece of paper and said that he would have one more condition. Brown-haired smilingly handed over a piece of paper and a pen so that Thords would simply sign the contract and the matter would be decided. The swindler at this time looked closely at the piece of paper and tried to understand what kind of contract it was. As it turned out, it was a standard labor contract, and he would even receive money for it. Brown-haired continued to smile, resting his chin on his finger, and said that 80% of his salary would be withheld to pay off the debt. The protagonist crossed his arms and with a mocking smile said that in 520 years he would be able to pay him off. The swindler's eyes bulged in horror and his mouth opened. Xavier looked angrily at the smiling protagonist and realized that he should not have expected anything else, because he came here not to sympathize and forgive. The brown-haired man continued to twist his smile in a malicious manner, and he did not consider himself a fool to kill someone who owed him money, because he would definitely not make such a rash step. Then the brown-haired man brought the tube to Talia's head and began to suck it, because he said that he would squeeze all the juices out of him until the end of his worthless life. The swindler immediately exclaimed excitedly, because he was curious why he offered him such a slave contract. The main character looked at him in surprise and realized that Thords had now begun to speak differently. The main character looked at him intently with angry looks, said that they had no choice but to force him to sign this contract by force and resolve this issue in court. The swindler immediately began to sign this contract with tears in his eyes. White clouds floated in the sky. At this time, the cart was carrying the guys along a forest path. The main character was riding in the cart with the knight and the swindler. Xavier held the blade on his shoulder and said that he managed to get some money from it, because it was enough to pay the interest for a couple of months. Lloyd did not understand what was being discussed, because he was going to use all this money for construction, because they had already been through this and 30 workers were not enough. The main character with a dissatisfied grin and leaned his hands on the cart when Xavier explained that someone from the villagers had to respond to their job ad or his reputation would precede him. It was a mountain range of a plain where there were fields. A couple of days later in the estate of the main character, there was a sign that labor was needed, where the salary was 20 gold and for information they should contact the Baron's estate. A whole crowd of people stood in line at the table in front of the Baron. Xavier stood next to the Baron, who assumed that all these people must hate him, to which Xavier wanted to express his opinion. The blue-haired knight closed his eyes and said that Lloyd had undertaken to install the heating system on time and at a low price, punished the traitor of the estate and forced him to appear before the highest court. Xavier looked down on the Baron and realized that he wanted to be considered a reliable person who could be trusted. The brown-haired man's eyes widened in surprise, realizing that it was quite simple. The guy approached the counter where the Baron was sitting and asked him about the work. Lloyd replied that he only needed to sign the contract. The main character's eyes widened in slight surprise when they wanted to express their gratitude to him. The brunette with a red scarf around his neck, smiling, stretched out his hands and said that his child caught a cold very easily, as soon as it got a little cold. But thanks to the young master and his system, he had nothing to worry about this year. The brown-haired man looked in surprise at the bow of the man who thanked him. Lloyd immediately smiled animatedly, his eyes wide, and he felt relieved. Although he was just trying to satisfy his greed, he felt somehow awkward. Then the Baron looked at this guy, who informed that he had relatives from the Racona estate, which was nearby, and they wanted to know if he could install his system there too. The brown-haired man's eyes widened in bewilderment and he realized that this was the first step to prosperity. He immediately smiled bloodthirstily from under his bangs and realized that everything was not in vain, because he had to increase the price, explaining everything with travel expenses and take all the money for himself. Xavier stared at the Baron's malicious smile, who said that he would really need funds to deliver all the goods to the place, and the knight was confused by this strange expression, because he assumed that this whole construction had only one purpose. The brown-haired man, continuing to smile mockingly, extended his index finger. The blue-haired knight imagined the unfinished road. The protagonist stood with his knight on the edge of the mountain, looking into the vast distance. The knight looked at the smiling grin of the gentleman, who said that sooner or later there would be nothing left on this mountain. Lloyd continued to smile through his bangs and said that the heating system required a lot of resources and soon only stumps would remain from the trees here. Xavier frowned in bewilderment through his bangs. The knight held his blade behind his back and understood that if the gentleman knew the outcome, then why did he continue to do this? Lloyd replied that this was precisely why he was stopping the construction of the Appian Road. It was a dug trench leading up the mountain because he wanted to start mining coal. The main character threw the shovel behind his head and began to smile maliciously because he wanted to sell this coal at an inflated price. And as soon as the whole of their system reaches the masses, people simply will not be able to resist such a temptation. Xavier looked angrily at the smiling gentleman, who said that their residents would receive a discount, but a very small one, and considered it unfair. Lloyd looked closely at the dissatisfied knight and asked about whether he really considered him so ruthless. The protagonist kept his eyes on his knight and asked what would happen if he gave up on this idea, hinting that then they would hardly be able to pay off the debt for the estate. The blue-haired guy continued to look at the protagonist with displeasure. He immediately closed his eyes, holding the blade, and said that he would agree that now they had no other choice. Then Xavier looked at the protagonist again and said that the Baron did not know about coal, and when he found out, he would not leave it so easily. The knight looked at Lloyd, who lowered his head and explained to him that others had also tried to start mining again and again. The protagonist knew all this, so everything collapsed due to the fragility of the roadbed. Then he again smiled maliciously from under his brows and said that he would succeed. He imagined a huge technological drilling rig in the ground and said that thanks to modern technologies for excavation work, he would succeed because he knew the shield method of driving. The brown-haired man immediately raised the shovel over his head with joy and said that great things awaited them, but Xavier did not understand this technology unknown to him. At this time, a joyful Lloyd threw the shovel over his shoulder and walked forward, because Xavier wanted to see what this completely different gentleman could do. It was the same destroyed tunnel, littered with stones. This trench stretched straight to the entrance of the cave, which was littered with stones. It was a deep earthen cave. An ant's paw appeared. Then the antennae of an ant appeared. A bunch of red eyes peered out of the darkness. There were angry, bloodthirsty ants. These were large ants that crowded in this cave. Lloyd at this time clapped his hands. He began to rotate the magical green ring with a star with his hands, using spells. He then raised the ring above his head and emitted a green stream of light into the sky, wishing to summon a high-class apartment for himself. The green stream of light stretched far into the night sky. Then, the stream immediately evaporated into a shining star. Suddenly, a huge house returned with this stream of light. He wished he had such a cool skill. He sat at the table and boredly emitted green light into the drawing. He emitted green from his finger, trying to finish the drawing because it took too much time. Notification that this was a mid-level design, an underground outlet plan. He immediately leaned back in his chair and tiredly declared that he wanted to summon 100 immortal workers who did not need to be paid more. Then he put his hands on the drawing again and began to finish it. Thanks to the Newman incident, he was able to earn 639 RP, making a great impression on the Baron and Baroness, Xavier, Baron, and others. It was a table of the level system with basic measurements and design. Because he invested points in pumping up his skills, he managed to get them. He stood on a rocky path near a collapsed cave because he realized that they would be digging here. He looked ahead with his green grid skill because it was an available mid-level skill, the underground scanning dimension. He scanned the entire space of the cave with green light and saw a room there because this skill only allows you to see at a distance of 5 meters and will help you find the right direction. Then he stood with a puzzled look, touching his chin with his hand and trying to figure out how to drill a passage in the shortest time, because an ordinary person cannot do this, and besides, people get tired quickly. At this time, Peepodong was fast asleep under the blanket and fell ill while building the road. Even if he recovers, it will be dangerous to use it because it is too big. The main character looked around through his bangs with displeasure and realized that he had no other choice. A window popped up in front of him with a random selection of a mystical creature that he had enough points for. He was sitting on the path, legs crossed, when a green light of appearance began to radiate in front of him. It was a green portal, from which a silhouette with a bow appeared. A snake girl with a bow on her head crawled out of this portal. This pink snake plopped down on the rocky path in front of the owner. This pink snake looked at the protagonist with admiration. The protagonist looked at her with bewilderment and assumed that at least she had poison, but she turned out to be completely harmless. But Peepodong also seemed like that at first, and perhaps this snake will be useful. The brown-haired man sat with his arms crossed and looked at the small pink snake, asking if she really increases in size after eating a sunflower seed and if she also has superpowers, to which he received a positive answer. Lloyd smiled and stretched out his hand and asked to show the snake all its abilities. This pink beast with closed eyes smiled widely. A few weeks later, this path led to a tunnel under construction in a cave. This snake was chained in a wooden barrel and dug a tunnel, eating the earth because the giant bell was moving inside the shield barrel. Then this pink snake chewed the earth because it was called a bell and had the skill of digging the earth level 1. At this time, the main character with a battered look stretched out his hand, while the huge bell crawled nearby and told Xavier to get ready. At this time, the naked knight in a sweaty state held the blade in front of him. Then the bell released hot streams of metal from its hole. The knight at this time swung his blade to knock down the flying metal rods. Meanwhile, the other blacksmith workers were trying to forge a reliable support on the forge. Step 5 was the realization of the harsh reality, as Xavier, with a dejected look, thought about why a knight like him should mess with the remains of a giant snake. Then Lloyd, with a towel around his neck, raised his hand and began to shout for the guys to continue working. At this time, the workers were pushing a wooden barrel into the depths of the cave, moving towards the goal. Lloyd wiped his face from sweat, looking at the empty pipe, because due to the lack of oxygen, his head was spinning, and if they had not brought the pipe here, they would have passed out long ago. Then the brown-haired man looked at the knight behind him, who said that it was time for them to stop, because like the other workers, he needed to rest. Lloyd turned his head and said that he was in charge here and should monitor the progress of the work, as a responsible person usually does. He looked through his long bangs with a dissatisfied look and realized that in Korea the bosses only know how to talk, and there are even such scoundrels who have never visited the place of work. So he swore to himself that he would never become like that and would monitor the entire process himself. Then he used his vision, scanning. He looked at the wall and saw a room with a green light where there were pieces of coal. He immediately picked up the shovel and began to rejoice with the rest of the workers that they were almost there and there was still a little left. Then Lloyd looked with a smile at the bell that was pressed to his face, and he thanked them for the fact that they did it many times faster. Then Lloyd looked back at the crowd of workers and his knight, giving an order that as soon as they reached the coal seam, they should dismantle the shield and expand the space. He looked at his workers near the stone wall and said that this was a rather dangerous undertaking, so everyone needed to be extremely careful. Then he looked back at the hole in the wall, hearing a strange sound. He continued to look at this layer of earth, listening to various sounds. He stared at the layer of earth with the other workers and realized that the earth cover here was strong and should not collapse. Then he began to look forward with a close underground scan with a green light. With this scan in the green room, he saw a crack in the wall and realized that it was not there before. He continued to watch this crack, seeing that it was growing. Suddenly, a huge bloodthirsty ant broke through the wall. Lloyd fell to the ground when the ant was about to attack him. Lloyd immediately grabbed his blade and was about to save his master. He swung his blade, looking at the bloodthirsty monster. Lloyd also did not want to stay aside and ran with his shovel. He delivered a crushing blow to the monster's head with the tool. With just one blow of the shovel, he flattened the ant's head. He looked at the corpse with a malicious look in the sweat of his brow and realized that this was an amazing thing, because something had appeared that was not said a word about in the novel. Then the knight together with the main character looked into a huge hole from where the black eyes of the other monsters appeared. These insects with a bloodthirsty look began to crawl in all directions. Lloyd immediately waved his hand at his workers, who began to run away in horror to the exit. At this time, Lloyd swung his blade and chopped all the monsters. The main character with an angry look, baring his teeth, tried to understand how many monsters were here, because if they got out, then they were finished. Xavier, out of breath, drew his blade, and Lloyd counted on him, but there was too little air here. At this time, the rest of the workers ran out of the mine, and he realized that it could not be destroyed without explosives, but even if the structure fell, there was a chance that the monsters would crawl out and tried to figure out what to do. At this time, Xavier slapped his master so that he would pull himself together and not panic. Then the enraged protagonist looked at the fighting knight and said that he did not panic, but thought. The angry knight looked back and said that he would not be able to hold back the monsters for long. Brown-haired held his shovel tightly, baring his teeth and thinking about what to do here with a tunnel with ants, coal, and a dungeon. It was an ordinary light bulb in a black space. Then this light bulb began to emit streams of discharges in all directions above the protagonist's head. Lloyd immediately grabbed the torch in the wall. He took his shovel and torch and shouted to the knight that they needed to move forward to attack. The blue-haired knight continued to grin furiously and realized that it sounded crazy, but he ran to attack. Xavier then deftly cut all the ant bodies with his blade because he realized that there was a point in this. The main character bloodthirstily ran to attack with his torch together with the knight. From the palace came screams that there was bad news for the Baron. Arcus opened his mouth in horror, hearing about the mutant ants and trying to understand where his son was. He immediately opened his armor cabinet, and the assistant said that all the workers were successfully evacuated, but Sir Xavier was still there and Baron would soon seal the entrance to the mine. Arcus immediately began to put on his armor and wanted to hurry, tightening his belt. Xavier bloodthirstily chopped the ants, from which blue splashes of blood flew. The knight held the blade in front of him, looking back with anger, trying to understand why there were more and more ants. The protagonist at this time held a torch and shouted that now was not the time for talking, because he was very busy. They stood back to back and fought off the mutant ants from all sides, because he understood that it was good that they did not come out of their holes, but the situation itself was very terrible. The knight bowed his head and fought with anger, because he was almost at the limit and did not care that it was hot here and little air, but there were a lot of ants. At this time, the protagonist angrily bared his teeth, using his scanning vision, because he was trying to find methane in the dungeon. They continued to fight the ants, standing next to each other in the cave. He understood that coal was a place where methanogens were spreading, and because of this, layers of methane gas were hidden under all the mineral veins. He pulled out his burning torch and tried to understand. If he could only find it, he would blow up all the ants. Then he looked closely at his knight behind him. With his scan, he looked at the ground and saw a piece of a layer of methane gas. He immediately stuck his shovel into the ground and was about to dig. He spread his legs wide and began to dig the ground, looking back at the knight and giving him the order to hold off the monsters. He immediately began to furiously dig the ground quickly. At this time, a huge ant tried to attack him. Xavier at this time swung his blade. While Lloyd was digging, Xavier, at this time, dealt with the rest of the monsters. Cutting the air around with his blade, he cut down the monsters, protecting the master. They immediately covered their ears from the loud earthquake and noise. A huge main ant appeared. The guys raised their heads in horror and realized that it was the queen ant. This huge monster immediately began to attack the guys. At this time, the brown-haired guy and the knight held their weapons and stared intently at the monster. Lloyd tried to ask his fighter if he could defeat her, to which he received a refusal. The brown-haired guy ironically said that if he did not try, he would not know, although Xavier understood that there were things that he could not do, even if he did not try it. The blue-haired guy put the blade behind his head and said that at the moment they still had no other choice. The queen ant furiously flew to attack. The knight immediately raised his blade and a blue core began to grow above it. He immediately attacked the belly of the queen monster with his blade. This bloodthirsty ant immediately fell into a stupor. The knight bloodthirstily stuck the tip of his blade into the monster's belly. Then he waved his weapon away from the monster. At this time, the brown-haired man continued to furiously dig the ground and understood that there was no time to lose, so he wanted his knight to hold out longer. At this time, the blue-haired knight swung his blade, fighting off the attack of the bloodthirsty queen of monsters. He stuck his shovel into the hole, and a stream of gas was heard from there. The brown-haired man immediately bared his teeth angrily in bewilderment. Lloyd immediately ran to his torch to grab it and told his fighter to run faster to the entrance. They began to run away from the cave and the monster was chasing them. It was an earthen cave where the chopped parts of the monsters lay, because they noticed a narrow passage that they had already used. The knight ran after the protagonist, who was holding a torch in his hands. Then our hero looked back, trying to throw the torch away. He immediately released a fiery torch towards the hole. This torch first hit the head and then flew off the ant. The fiery torch continued to fly into the depths of the cave, bouncing off the ground. The Queen of Monsters was about to finish off the prostrate main character. This flow of gas from the ground began to intensify. Suddenly, the entire space of the cave began to be enveloped in fire. A powerful fiery explosion occurred. The knight covered the master with his body when the explosion occurred. The ants watched the growing fiery explosion. It was a powerful surge of fiery energy. The knight continued to press the protagonist to the ground, protecting him with his body. At this time, Arcus, along with other knights and assistants, stood at the entrance to the mine. They tried to hold Arcus, who was about to run in armor to save his son. After the explosion, the battered Xavier continued to press Lloyd with his body. The brown-haired man at this time held his ears, grimacing. Then he began to get up, looking at the fallen Queen Ant and realized that her plan worked. Then he looked closely at the lying knight and realized that he protected him. Then he picked up the pink snake and apologized to her for being in such a state. Then he looked up at the entrance. He saw that their entrance was completely blocked. He began to get up, leaning his hand on the shovel, and his ears were ringing. A notification popped up that there was a lack of oxygen. He looked ahead with his scanning vision and displeasure. He again saw the entrance with the help of scanning and realized that he needed to dig through faster, but he also had to dig more than 5 meters. A bar with the oxygen level appeared, which was already running out. He stuck the shovel into the ground and was about to dig because they had no other way out. At this time, the battered Xavier raised his gaze. With his cloudy vision, he saw Lloyd digging the ground and shouting that they should get out together. The knight continued to lose consciousness and barely saw Lloyd's silhouette, who wanted to save them all. Then the blue-haired knight fell unconscious, hanging his head. A notification from the system appeared, which admired his act of not abandoning the knight. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of him had increased by +6. Received 108 RP, accumulated 157. The completely out-of-breath protagonist tried to catch his breath in the sweat of his brow. a notification with an oxygen level that was already on the edge. He understood that he had nothing more to lose and the oxygen level had noticeably decreased. The brown-haired man threw the shovel behind his head and frowned in the sweat of his brow, turning to the system because he wanted to find a search for knowledge that could develop skills. The system overload appeared. The main character stood with an angry look in the blue circle of the system. A message popped up that knowledge was detected and the absorption of the surrounding mana began. It was a bunch of pop-up notifications where, by combining these skills, he would be able to master the technique of the Azrahan core. He smiled maliciously, raising his fist, and was glad that he had not given up training since the duel with Newman and would be able to develop his skill as he wanted. His system asked in the window whether he wanted to master this technique, and he agreed. He spread his legs wide and began to absorb the blue color because he had acquired the skill of the aura. A glimmer of blue appeared in space. This ray of light began to circulate in space. His gray silhouette looked calm when the beam of light enveloped his heart, and he felt it all, but unfortunately, he did not have mana in his heart, but he could feel the presence of rings. Notification that mana had expanded by 120%. He slightly pressed his lips and realized that if he were an ordinary person, even if he trained hard, he might not get the result right away. But he had RP. A window with the Azrahan core technique popped up where he was going to increase the level in one click. He immediately pressed the increase skill key with his finger and inserted everything. He spread his legs wide again, began to study the blue light because he had increased the level of the core technique. Notification that mana had expanded by 125%. Then he again wanted to increase the level and pressed the corresponding key. He furiously continued to increase his level by pressing the key. But he tried to figure out if he would need these points later, but now he had no choice and would level up as long as he could. Out of breath, he stretched his finger to the system window, wanting to level up. Rays of blue light filled the space with them. The protagonist looked at the ongoing technique of the dual ring core in surprise, and the mana increased by 200%. A message that 100 points were needed before increasing the next level, but he only had 7 left. He bared his teeth with a shabby look and tried to figure out how things were now and whether the number of rings had increased. A window appeared where he had an available skill, and he couldn't help but feel tired for 10 minutes. Message with an available skill is an energy burst, where there was an expansion of mana, which will increase by 3 times for 20 seconds. He bloodthirstily grabbed his shovel, baring his teeth and wanting to go further. He raised the shovel over his head with a bloodthirsty expression and emitted light discharges into the entire space. He began to dig even harder at a fast pace. A message about the oxygen level, which was almost running out. The protagonist bared his teeth with a furious look and really wanted to see the flow of oxygen. With the help of scanning, he saw a room and wanted to find just a small opening, because if he could only find a crack, he would be able to breathe. He continued to dig the ground with his shovel, creating a cave. After a moment, he had already excavated a significant part of the cave. A red message about the oxygen level approaching 0. He stared ahead with a piercing gaze with the help of scanning, sweating. With the help of scanning, he saw a hole in the wall and saw an exit. Screams and dust from excavations were heard from the cave. At this time, the knight lay unconscious along with the pink snake. Lloyd continued to bloodthirstily dig the tunnel. A red message about the oxygen level was already running out. The protagonist opened his mouth wide, wanting to find a way out. That same red notification that the oxygen was already running out. With the help of scanning, he saw this hole, which was about 3 meters away. He fell to his knees. He also dropped his shovel. He was sitting on his knees with a dejected look, because the effect of the skills had ceased. While Xavier and the snake lay unconscious, Lloyd was sitting on his knees. He immediately thought about the release of energy, grabbed the shovel again and jumped up with a bloodthirsty look. He began to dig the ground again with an intensified look. With the help of scanning, he almost approached the hole, because there was very little left for it. Notification of the oxygen level, which was completely over. The main character fell to the ground unconscious. Everything ended quickly. He lay on the ground with a half-dead look and realized that as the son of a nobleman living in a remote area, he only dreamed of a quiet life. Then he closed his eyes. He lay on his stomach, on the ground near the shovel. Suddenly there was a sound. The brown-haired man slightly opened his eyes, convulsively tried to stick, looking at the cave, hearing the sounds. Suddenly, Peepadong burst through the hole in the ground with a joyful look. Lloyd, with a joyful look, bulged his eyes with a smile. He immediately opened his mouth wide and began to inhale fresh air. Then, with the help of a shovel, he was going to get up and understood that a quiet life was definitely waiting for him. The night blue moon illuminated the mountain plain. A hot torch was in the cave. Arcus, along with the rest of the fighters, went inside with the help of torches. Bayern walked next to him and said that it was dangerous to go further, but the Baron asked everyone to go back, and he himself would go to the end. Arcus stared ahead with a torch. He saw 2 silhouettes when his son carried a knight. The protagonist with a tired look carried his faithful comrade on his back. A message popped up that using exceptional skills in an emergency situation had helped him surpass the limits of human ability, and the special case coupled with the skill of Azrahan's core technique had a strong effect on him. Notification with the available skill of the power mode. Even when he was greatly exhausted, traces of the core technique could still have an effect. Arcus immediately dropped the torch and ran to his son. The protagonist, looking tired, carried the body of the unconscious knight. The brown-haired man and the unconscious knight fell into Arcus's arms. A large blue moon was visible through the black clouds.